welcome to the Plant School podcast. I'm Rachel Tenney, and here we learn all about plants, how they work, how to care for them, and it's all taught in a way that anyone from beginner to expert can listen to, understand, and enjoy. So I hope that you will join me in Plant School. Hello and welcome to the Plant School podcast. Today we are going to be talking about ferns. I am really excited to do this episode. This is actually one I did previously when I first started the podcast with my husband, Sam. And to make a long story short, those episodes are now archived. You can't find them anymore because the podcast has changed so much. But I remember this one because I fell in love with ferns when we first did this episode. So to go back and find it and revisit it and add in new information, it was so fun. And I think I love ferns just as much as I did back then, maybe even more. But before we get into the meat of this episode, I quickly want to announce our giveaway winners. I do this every single episode where I pick two giveaway winners. One comes from Apple Podcasts, someone who has left a review on there. And the other winner comes from Spotify, someone who has answered the little question underneath the most recent episode. They're just questions for fun. There's literally no wrong answers. So if you're listening on either of those, on Apple, leave a review. On Spotify, answer the question and you are automatically entered in. And if you're wondering what you win, our sponsor is Market Botany, and they send you a bottle of Prop Drops, which is a propagation aid for all your water propagations. You just get the dropper, put in a few drops. I've been using it. I love it. It's been helping me with my propagation so much. Helps them root faster, not get root rot, and it's been amazing. And then they also send you a bottle of Leaf Shine. Again, I love their product. It's now my new favorite Leaf Shine product, and that is what you win from them. And if you're interested in their products, they actually have given us a code to use. So if you go to marketbotany.com/shop, you can use the code Plant School Podcast. No caps, no spaces, just Plant School Podcast, and that will give you 10% off your entire order. So thank you, Market Botany, for sponsoring our giveaways here. I'm going to go ahead and announce the winners, starting with Spotify. Last episode, I asked you guys if you've ever had a pet destroy a houseplant. And boy, a lot of you had some stories. For example, someone said that their housemate brought one home and their two cats ate it. And also pooped in the pot. I would feel so bad unless your housemate/roommate was not a very good one. Then maybe I wouldn't feel so bad about that. Another person said that their pet bumped into it, knocked it over, and it split. Another person said that their cat likes to eat their spider plant, and apparently it has the same effect as magic mushrooms on them. That's so interesting. Maybe that should be a whole episode that we go into. Are there houseplants that act as psychedelics for pets? I don't know, honestly, but that would be super interesting. Anyways, our winner today that I chose is Gail Lyons. She said, my cat devoured in all caps, all of the leaves on my Dracaena, but she has miraculously made a full comeback. Yay, plants are amazing. I agree. They are amazing. So glad your Dracaena made it through that. Gail, please email me at tenneyplants@gmail.com, TENNEY plants@gmail.com, and I will get you that little package sent to you from Market Botany. Our winner over on Apple Podcasts, someone who has left a review, their username is BBTemp. They said, as a complete beginner, I really enjoy this podcast because I can understand it. I've tried several others that said they were for beginners, and I was so lost in the first 15 minutes of an episode that I quit because it definitely required some previous knowledge. I've been there too. This podcast is easily digestible and the host is great at explaining further for those more advanced topics. As someone who never had any luck with any plants in my youth, I'm surprised to hear that the plants I've had luck with keeping alive, orchids and calatheas, are considered difficult plants. And she goes on to talk about how she has kept an orchid that was gifted to her alive and her rattlesnake calathea. and a few other ones that are on the more difficult side, and ends with, guess I have a knack for the difficult ones. It really sounds like it because that is impressive. So BB Temp, if that was you, please email me at tinnyplants@gmail.com and I will get your package sent your way as well from Market Botany. All right, let's go ahead and dive into this episode, starting with the question that I always start with for these care guides, and it is asking, what is this plant? So what is a fern? And I am sure all of you know what a fern is, have had an encounter with one, because they are literally everywhere, and we will talk about that. But they are a flowerless plant with these feathery or leafy fronds, and they reproduce by spores. A lot of houseplants reproduce by flowers. They are angiosperms, but that is not the case for ferns. So they can range from really tiny small plants to huge tree ferns that are 25 meters or 80 feet in height. Some ferns look like vines, while others float on the surface of ponds. There is such a range to ferns. Honestly, when I was prepping for this episode, it was a little bit overwhelming because ferns just include a huge amount of plants. There's about 10,500 known fern species. So they're all in the class Polypodiocida, and the ferns that you know as houseplants, they actually cover many genuses in this one class. So if you're unfamiliar, a scientific name of a plant goes genus and then species. So each fern, so those popular ferns in the store, there's a lot of different genuses. Normally when I cover these care guide episodes, it's usually just within one genus, but ferns, it's like a whole class of plants. So let me just give you an example of some of the different genuses that you may see in like a houseplant store. So your sword fern or your Boston fern, they're the same thing. That's Nephrolepis exaltata. And there actually is another Nephrolepis that you might see pretty often. It's the button fern. That's the Nephrolepis cordifolia. But moving on, the bird's nest fern, another popular one, is Asplenium nidus. So not in the Nephrolepis genus at all. Your maidenhair fern is in the Adiantum genus. Your staghorn fern is in the Platycerium genus. Your kangaroo fern, its scientific name is Zealandia pustulata. So again, just a whole other different genus. The asparagus fern is another popular fern, but it's actually not a real fern. That's like a whole other thing. There's a lot of plants that are called ferns, and they are not actually true ferns. So the asparagus fern is in a different class of plants. But regardless of their genus, many of these popular ferns that we have in our homes, they do have very similar needs in common. Hence why I continued on with this care guide to give you some tips on how to care for them in the second half of this episode. Just know, this episode is not completely useless because it's such a big class of plants. They are pretty similar in their care, with a few exceptions that I will touch on and let you know. So moving on, let's talk about what they symbolize. They symbolize quite a few things. They're believed to symbolize protection, rain, confusion, wealth, and it comes from like various different pieces of folklore. So the rain one, that comes from England. They believe that if you burned the fronds of ferns, that it would rain. Another example, the confusion one, that comes from people believing that travelers would become confused and lose their way if they stepped on ferns. Another piece of folklore is that in Wicca, which is like, I believe like a magical practice, like Wiccan practices, I'm not completely sure, but they believe that ferns have magical properties. For example, they believe that a dried fern can be thrown into hot coals of a fire to exorcise evil spirits. Not exercise like lift weights, like exercise, like get them out. Is there a difference in how you say those two words, exorcise? There probably is. They also believed that smoke from a burning fern would drive away snakes and other reptiles. Another piece of folklore, I really hope that this one is true. This would be nice. So you put a frond under your pillow. A frond is basically one of their leaves, and you will dream of the solution to a perplexing problem. I could use that one. It's also believed that hanging dried fronds would protect everyone from lightning and thunder. And also it's believed that if you carry the seeds of a fern in your pocket, that you would have special powers like invisibility. This one I'm confused about because ferns don't produce seeds, they produce spores. Maybe this one is kind of just a bust. You can't carry the seed of a fern, therefore you will have no special powers like invisibility. That's why it hasn't been discovered yet, guys. We can't have invisibility powers because ferns don't have seeds. But this actually comes from a Finnish tradition. They believe that a fern could bloom on midsummer night. Again, they can't. They don't bloom, unfortunately. But this is their tradition, and if you found it, you could take this flower, take its seed, and you would be guided and be able to travel invisibly to the locations where the eternally blazing will-o'-the-wisps mark the spot of hidden treasure. So yeah, that's quite a piece of folklore for you. But honestly, they're all kind of fun. Moving on, let's talk about where they originate. So, where did they originate? Ferns go so far back. They evolved from the Devonian period, which was about 360 million years ago, and they have diversified from there. They have had a long time to diversify. It is such an ancient plant, so they are native to nearly every environment. Forests, they are there. Deserts, tropics, alpine, aquatic, every single environment you can find different types of ferns. Of course, they are more abundant in some of those environments than others. So in the tropics, for example, you can find a lot of them. Somewhere like Costa Rica has around 900 species of ferns, whereas if you go over to the Arctic and Antarctic regions, they have very few species. And though there are so many of them, they are actually not usually invasive. They kind of keep to their native ranges. There are a few exceptions, such as the bracken fern, which they are known to spread quickly in fields and pastures. It has these rope-like rhizomes. Rhizomes are underground stems, so they kind of just stem off underground, a new plant pops up. And the reason why this is a problem is because they're quite poisonous for those grazing animals, so they really can't have them in those fields and pastures. Another example is the giant water fern, or Salvinia molesta, and it is one of the world's worst aquatic weeds. So, with a few exceptions, they generally keep to themselves and don't cause too many problems. Thank goodness. But let's dive deeper. Let's talk about their history, because they have a lot. They have a lot of history. And if you've been listening to this podcast for a bit, you know that this is my favorite question. I love learning about where plants come from. How did they become houseplants that are in our homes that we love today? So starting way back, way back, like I mentioned, they're prehistoric plants, one of the oldest groups of plants on Earth. I mentioned just barely that they're around 360 million years old, and these primitive ferns, along with other plants, is what makes up coal that we mine today as our fossil fuels. And most earliest ferns have gone extinct. They don't exist anymore. The modern ferns that we know today are pretty new, and that's like all relative, right? By pretty new, I mean they have developed in the past 70 million years, which, considering their lifespan being 360 million years old, that is pretty new. But this was super interesting. There is one fern, and research is ongoing, but as of right now, the Osmunda claytoniana, this fern is an example of evolutionary stasis, meaning that it really has not changed. Its DNA from today compared to fossilized DNA from 180 million years ago is the same. That blows my mind. Out of the over 10,000 species of ferns that we have today, that is only one that has kept its DNA the same from its fossilized DNA. So it was in the 1700s, mid-1700s, Carl Linnaeus originally recognized 15 genuses of ferns and fern allies. Fern allies are plants that are quite similar to ferns. By 1806, it had increased from 15 to 38 genuses and has progressively increased from there. In the Victorian era, there was this kind of strange craze of fern collecting. They called it pterodomania, and you can see it in their art at the time. They had fern motifs on their decorative art. They had sculptures of ferns. They used them on their gravestones. This was just kind of the thing in the Victorian era, and it started when gardeners went into local forests to gather them. Fern Gathering Day was a major event. Nearly every Victorian home had one, and if you were wealthy, you would collect exotic varieties of ferns. Charles Kingsley, he was a Victorian era novelist. He wrote about this. A lot of women would go out and collect these ferns, and he thought there was something going on with them, like pathologically. And he thought women would be healthier if instead they would be preoccupied with novels and gossip. Obviously, that sort of idea would not fly today. Charles Kingsley, you would be definitely canceled. But it was a very popular thing at that time. And surprisingly, kind of moving on from that, we actually didn't understand ferns too much until the 19th century. We did not know how they reproduced. So as I mentioned, they do not flower. Sorry to say, all you people in Finland that believe that Finnish tradition that you could find its flower on Midsummer Night. But because there are no flowers, it really stumped a lot of ancient people. They thought ferns did have special powers because they seemed to have some sort of invisible seed. They thought it would grant you invisibility. So actually, Finnish people, I forgive you. That would be confusing, and I get why you would come up with that folklore tradition. It does seem like it has an invisible seed. So this is how they actually reproduce. We're going to get a little bit sciencey, but I promise I'm not going to go too in-depth. So the fern that you see, it is physically there, sitting in your living room or at the grocery store you see when you're shopping, you are seeing its second phase. And if you've ever looked underneath a fern leaf, a lot of them have these little clusters of spores on the underside of their leaves, and that is what is falling to the ground to start the first phase all over again. So basically, the first phase is when one of those fallen spores grows into a prothallus. It's like a heart-shaped flat mass with these little root-like anchors to keep it in place against wind or water. I remember looking at these way back in biology class, and you need a microscope, okay? You need a microscope to see these little guys. And on the prothallus, they have these tiny scale-like sex organs, both male and female. So when water or wind is present, sperm cells are released, and they find the eggs on the prothallus, on that same little heart-shaped flat mass. And when that has successfully occurred, the prothallus stops those reproductive activities of creating eggs and sperm, and it starts differentiating its cells to become roots, to become the stem and the leaves. And this is what we know as the second stage. It's called a sporophyte. So the fern in your house is in the sporophyte stage. The first stage is called a gametophyte, the one that you can't see, that you need a microscope for. But once you're sporophyte, the second stage grows into an adult. It does not have any sex organs, just those spores. And that entire process of having the gametophyte stage, then sporophyte, it can take up to 1 month. It can take 2 to 3 years. It really just depends on the type of fern. And that is how they reproduce. I hope you found it as interesting as I did. Moving on, in their history, ferns, they don't really hold great economic value for us. They do have minor food and medicinal uses in some parts of the world. So I'm going to give you some examples. One that is still eaten today is the fern croziers. Those are the young leaves that are kind of coiled up and have the hook-shaped tips. Specifically, it's the fern croziers of the ostrich fern. They are eaten in northeastern North America. I've never had one, but maybe I should go to the Northeast and find one to eat. Another dish is the vegetable fern. It's used in the tropic regions in a dish called budapacus. Again, never tried that one. Another popular one is using the tubers from the king fern, and it is a traditional food in New Zealand and the South Pacific. Another example is that natives of the Pacific Northwest would actually chew licorice fern rhizomes for their flavor. I assume from the name, licorice fern, they would taste like licorice. And fern tubers were used for food in Europe, but this was about 30,000 years ago that we have proof that they were eating them. Not so much today. In East Asia, this one is an example that might not be so great, but they commonly consume the Osmunda and Pteridinium genus of ferns, and they have actually found those ferns to be a carcinogenic, meaning it can spur on cancer. So there does need to be some caution when you are thinking of eating a fern, because not all of them are the same. But an example of a fern's economic value, this one is really interesting. Normally when we would think of a fern's economic value, we would think of the houseplant industry, which of course is probably the biggest region of its economic value. That and like the indoor and outdoor gardening industries. They're used a lot in landscaping and also in floral design. But besides those industries, there is a little fern called the tiny mosquito fern. And within it, it contains blue-green algae that can convert nitrogen into a usable form for other plants. Nitrogen is what makes a plant green. They all need it. It's one of the 3 main macronutrients that a plant needs, so it's a big deal. So the fact that this tiny mosquito fern can make nitrogen more readily available for other plants is really useful. And so it has become very important in increasing productivity of rice paddies. So those farms, I guess you could say, where they have those rice paddies, they are growing rice. A lot of them will use the mosquito fern in helping the rice get the nitrogen that it needs. So it's very desirable over there, has a lot of economic value. But besides that, ferns are also used as a biofertilizer. They are sometimes used to remediate contaminated soil. So if there's an area where the soil has been contaminated by chemicals, other human uses such as that, they can plant in ferns, and that will help the soil return to its natural state and get those toxic chemicals out, which is really cool. Moving on, New Zealand's symbol for their national identity is actually the silver fern, and it has been the silver fern since the 1880s. To them, the people of New Zealand, the fern represents strength, stubborn resistance, enduring power, and attachment to their homeland. So you can find it on the symbol of their passports in New Zealand. It's a symbol of their national airline, Air New Zealand, and it's also the symbol of their rugby team, the All Blacks. And today, it is obviously a big deal in the houseplant industry, in the gardening industry, in certain zones. Its popularity has kind of leveled out, especially since the Victorian era, right? But it is so versatile that it has remained a great houseplant, and it's still beloved today. All right, so that concludes its history, and now let's move in to how to care for a fern. So if you have one, if you're thinking of getting one, this is how you would keep it alive. Number one, let's talk about how to water them. Ferns love moisture and humidity. The houseplants that you are normally getting from the store are usually from more humid places. So a naturally humid location like your bathroom is an ideal situation. They like the range between like 40 to 50% humidity. Normally our homes are within that range. Of course, bathrooms can get a little bit higher when someone is using them and showering. So that is why they do really well there. But you do want to keep their soil moist, not wet, and let the soil get dry, but only briefly between waterings. The exception to this rule is Boston ferns, footed ferns, and staghorn ferns. They need a little bit more water than the others. If you feel like you're overwatering, you can see early signs of it with black discoloration on the visible tips of fern roots at the top of the soil. On the other hand, underwatering can cause your fronds to turn yellow. Also, fronds turning yellow can be from the air being too dry or it being near a heat source. You can also get dry leaf tips from the air being dry and being by a heat source as well. To help with this, to kind of keep them from getting too dry and not worrying about having to water them too much, a lot of people will put a layer of moss on top of the soil that can just kind of help retain that moisture, and then you don't have to worry about watering them every few days. Moving on to their lighting needs. They love good indirect sunlight. Direct sunlight can burn them if they are not used to it. The fronds will start to turn pale if they're in too bright of a spot with brown, crispy leaf edges. That's how you know you probably need to move them. And too little sun can cause really poor growth or yellowing fronds. They do prefer a cooler environment with little direct heat. So in those winter months, really try and keep them away from your heat registers and things like that. A temperature between 64 to 75 degrees Fahrenheit is ideal for them. That's 18 to 24 degrees Celsius. And yes, you can keep them outside. Depending on what type of fern you have and what zone you live in, they can often be kept outside. I'm always so jealous of those cute little farmhouses that have ferns hanging up outside on their porches. It's just such a cute vibe. I think if I did that here, they'd probably fry. But hey, if you're somewhere more in the southern United States, I'm in the US, so that's all I can speak to. But if you're in the southern US, I feel like you can get away with having your ferns outside much more so than perhaps I could, at least for sticking it on my porch and having it hang there. All right, let's move on to how to repot one and what kind of soil they like. So most of our ferns that we have as houseplants are forest or woodland plants. They need a really rich soil. Of course, the exception to that is your staghorn fern, because those are usually mounted on moss because they are an epiphyte, meaning they grow on top of another plant. But otherwise, you are going to want to choose a rich soil that is well draining. Having peat, organic matter, and sand mixed in is really great. They actually have pre-made fern mixes, or you can make your own. And when it comes to repotting, you want to repot if the roots have really filled the pot, they're coming out of the bottom. But just know that ferns are pretty slow growing in general, so you won't be repotting them often. And if you do want to give them a refresh without repotting it, you can take off the top layer and replace it with fresh soil, and that will kind of give it a nutrient boost. Moving on, how to prune one. This one's really easy. You basically just remove any dead fronds. The fronds will die back naturally over time. It's completely natural. I also love to take mine outside every once in a while and kind of just gently comb through its fronds and shake it a little bit, because a lot of those little leaflets on the fronds will die or get yellow. At least mine do. Maybe I don't take great care of it. But they're just nice to shake every once in a while to get rid of that dead growth, and then you can trim off any remaining fronds that are dead in there. Or maybe you don't like the way they look, you can remove those too, but the general rule is to not remove more than 25% of your plant at a time. So keep that in mind if you are going in and removing ones that aren't looking that great. Let's move on to propagation. And then I have just 2 questions after this. But propagation, there are multiple ways. I'm going to talk about the simple ways first, because that's probably what we'll be doing. So a lot of ferns, it's really simple. You can just divide them, because most ferns have rhizomes. I don't know how it would work with a staghorn fern. I'm sure they can be separated as well. But for the ferns that are just in pots, a lot of them do have rhizomes, which are those underground stems. So something like your sword fern or Boston fern, your maidenhair fern, those can all be divided, simply meaning you take it out of its pot and you divide it. You pull it in half. Try not to rip it up too much, but from there you have 2 plants, you stick them in new pots. There are other ferns that produce bulblets. There's the bulblet fern, the soft shield fern, and you can find them usually in the soil. Sometimes they are found along the leaf surface. The bulblet fern and the soft shield fern produce them on the leaf surface, and you can remove those and produce a new plant. I remember when I was repotting my fern, I found all these little bulblets. They look like tiny little potatoes. And at first I was very confused on what these tiny little potatoes were, but they were bulblets. And if you want, you can take them, plant them in some rich soil, and eventually they will start to put out new fronds. Okay, and quickly, just for fun, because I don't know if any of you listening are crazy enough to try this way, but this is the complicated way. You can collect the spores from the spore cases on the underside of your fronds, and then you can get a magnifying glass and examine them to make sure that they are ripe, they are not empty. These little spore cases are called sporangia. So you're going to look at the sporangia and you're going to see if there are any spores in there. And then you're going to place the fronds. I'm saying this like we're actually going to do it. But you're going to place the fronds with those ripe spores in a manila envelope and let them dry for a week at like 70 degrees Fahrenheit. And then eventually, once those spores have come off after they've dried, you're going to gently tap that manila envelope, get the spores out of it on top of sterilized, moist soil, or you can use like a peat moss or perlite mix. And then you are going to cover it with something like glass or perhaps a plastic film. You're going to keep it moist with distilled water, and from there, the spores, if you remember back to how they grow, the spores are going to germinate, produce moss-like growth. This is the gametophyte stage. And if you give it enough water, that sperm is going to move and find the eggs. That's the male gamete are going to swim to find the female archegonium. That's what it's called. And then finally, you will get the second stage, and you will get the small leafy sporophytes. And this will happen in about 2 to 3 months. And then you can transfer them to a pot for further growth. So if you just want to go crazy, you can go the complicated way. But for most people, dividing them, that's the easiest way to go. All right, my last 2 questions. These ones are super quick and easy. Are they prone to any pests? Yes, they are. They are prone to scale, mealybug, and spider mites. Ferns are kind of hard to deal with when it comes to pests because there are so many crevices and places to hide. So my advice would be to use a pesticide to get rid of these bugs. Showering them down can help, also changing their environment. Removing them manually with a cotton swab with a little bit of rubbing alcohol on it can also help. But pests can be really hard to deal with ferns. And my last question is, how long do these plants live? Well, if you give it its proper care, some have been known to live up to 100 years, but it really depends on the species. So in your home, they definitely can last many, many years, perhaps decades, and I am confident that if you give it the care it needs, that it will last you that long. And with that, that includes our fern care guide. Thank you so much for listening to today's episode, and I hope that you will join me in 2 weeks for a brand new episode of the Plant School podcast. Thank you so much for being here and for listening to the Plant School podcast. I hope that you will join me for our next episode. And if you would like to support this podcast and keep it going, there's a link down in the show notes of this episode where you can donate to this podcast. And I really appreciate all that help. Or you can go to my merch store, which is also linked in the notes of this episode. And you can find some really cool plant-related shirts and stickers. And if you want to support the podcast but spend no money, feel free to share it with a friend, leave a review. All these things greatly help me out and allow me to keep doing this. Again, thank you so much for listening and for being here at the Plant School podcast.